So welcome to you all. I know this class has been postponed a couple of times for various reasons, so I'm sorry about that, but you know, things like planning and timing and programming, it's all impermanent and it changes. So this is one of the things that changed. So my name's Lhagsam Lhagsam really, my whole name. I generally live up at Chenrezig Institute now, but I've been coming to Lhagsam since 1992, and I've continued coming here even though I'm living at Chenrezig Institute. So Chenrezig Institute's a sister centre for Lhagsam Centre, and it's up behind in hinterland behind the Sunshine Coast, up in the hills. So both centres have been closed to visitors in the last couple of months, and they're gradually looking at planning to open over the coming months. So I just wanted to say before we started, if there's questions you've got, you can type them into the chat, and Miffy will put up her hand and I'll see that. Even though I don't see you, I'll see that, and we can just let me know if I say anything. Sometimes I use Buddhist words that may not be clear. They certainly were not clear to me when I first heard them. So it's a very good thing to not let me just keep talking on without understanding exactly what I mean by the particular words. So we're going to start with just a little breathing meditation to settle our minds and a motivation. So our minds, we become very clear about what our goal is in listening to Dharma teachings and trying to understand as much as possible as we can. So in general, for meditation, the most important thing is definitely to be comfortable. Don't try and squish your body into some shape that's not comfortable for you, because it doesn't. There's a traditional way, but that's because traditionally people sat that way 2,500 years ago. And in some countries that's still very much what they do, but not so much here in Australia. So whether it's a chair or a cushion or even lying down. Some people can meditate lying down, but that's a bit beyond me. I just tend to nod off or daydream or something. I have to be more alert, yes. So just a comfortable position, your back relatively straight within the natural curve of your back, not rigid, relaxed. All of you just relaxed. So find that nice comfortable position for you, and if anywhere in a meditation there's some tension builds up or some part of you becomes uncomfortable, just gently readjust your posture and just move that part, whatever it is, so as you're comfortable. And then just bring your attention to the breath, just not trying to change it or force it into something else, just observing your breath. And there are different places where we can meditate on the breath. We can meditate on the breath at the opening of our nostrils. There are just subtle sensations there. Sometimes the air's cooler as we breathe in, a little movement of the hairs in the nostrils, so we can be aware of those sensations. And sometimes if we're getting a little bit drowsy, bringing our attention to those sensations, focusing there for a few moments, can help regain our concentration and our alertness. We can focus on the movement in our chest as our ribs expand and contract with each breath. And we can also be aware of the more subtle movement in our abdomen. And if we find at some time our mind's getting distracted or overly busy, we're losing our focus, observing the breath in this part, in the abdomen, can just help increase the stability and bring calm to that overexcited mind. And now we're going to develop a motivation. So in many of the meditations and teachings, having a clear idea of the goal that we're trying to achieve is a very useful thing, because it helps us to gauge whether we're moving towards that goal that we have. So there might be particular reasons that we're, coming to these teachings. We might have an idea of something we wish to achieve specifically. But either way, the goal that most of us have, incorporated in all those, is finding some way to improve aspects of our life. Most of the things we do are like this. But specifically, in looking at the Buddhist teachings, we're looking to understand what it is the Buddha taught, and also how we can use those things he taught in our life. So if we have a motivation to think that we're doing this to benefit ourselves, find things that are useful for us, but also expanding that out to include being able to benefit others who we come in contact with, whoever that might be. So this doesn't mean we necessarily give them things or something like that. If we give them a smile and our kindness and our time, these sorts of things, these are hugely beneficial. So the main motivation, the structured motivation we're going to use is what's called the 4 immeasurable thoughts, or sometimes the 4 immeasurable prayers. So the immeasurable relates to there being immeasurable numbers of living beings that exist, and expanding our thoughts, our positive thoughts towards all of them. So the first of the 4 immeasurable thoughts is immeasurable loving kindness, the wish that beings have happiness. Imagine what the world would be like if all living beings had happiness and the causes of happiness, everything that they needed and wished for. Just take a few moments to imagine how different the world would be. Imagine how people you know would act if they had happiness, always had joy and happiness in their minds, and how they would naturally treat each other with kindness all through their lives. And the second one is immeasurable compassion, wishing that beings be free of suffering. Imagine if all living beings were free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. Imagine this happening to the people closest to you. Imagine this happening for all the people you know about, but you don't know personally. This might be people you've heard about in the news or friends of friends. And finally, imagine how all the destructive people, those who've hurt you or your friends, your family, how they would act completely differently if they were free from their happiness, unhappiness and their suffering and the disturbing thoughts and emotions in their minds. Thirdly, the immeasurable joy. Allow a great wish to arise in your heart that all living beings have long-lasting happiness, never separated from this happiness that's totally without suffering. And finally, the immeasurable thought of equanimity. May all the living beings in the world abide in equanimity, free from clinging attachment to friends, free of hatred for enemies, completely free of prejudice and bias. So then, if you've closed your eyes during the meditation, now's the time to open them. And this is the motivation we have in doing the different teachings. It's the 4 immeasurable thoughts, often in different prayers, pujas, different ceremonies, as the motivation for the things, the virtuous things we're about to do. So when we think about Buddhism, we often think about it in comparison to other spiritual traditions or religions that we have been brought up with or are prevalent in our society. And I know when I was young, there were there were no Buddhist teachings that came into my life. There was very few Buddhist teachings available in English. The various Buddhists that were migrants to Australia would sometimes have teachers come, or they might support a temple or something, but the teachings tended to be in the language of those people, Sri Lankan or Burmese or Chinese, whatever it might be. And so there were some books, but it wasn't an easy thing to find out what the Buddha taught. I don't know when I first ever even knew that he existed. So, and we usually compare things with what we already know. So all these different spiritual traditions and religions, they teach about developing a good, kind heart and about treating other people well, teaching values like honesty and refraining from harming others, having compassion and patience and forgiveness, bringing harmony into families and communities. And Buddhism's the same in this sort of way. There's a lot of emphasis on developing compassion, ethical behaviour, non-violence, these sorts of things. And there are several differences between Buddhism and other spiritual traditions. And we'll talk about some of them today. And the further you go into the teachings, and you know, the great teachers, they study for 25, 30 years, these teachings, and so there's a great deal of difference in some of those philosophical discussions. But one of the main differences is that the life of the Buddha wasn't always a Buddha. And we are, in this class, we're going to talk about Buddha's life. And his life is an example of how he progressed from being an ordinary being like us and then achieved this state of complete and perfect enlightenment. So the things that he taught are the things that helped him achieve this. And he taught so as we could progress along the same path. And there's a story, don't ask me where I heard it, but there is a story of Buddha once walking through the forest. There was a lot of forest in India then, of course. And he picked up a handful of leaves and he said to his students and disciples who were with him, "Are there more leaves in my hand or in this whole forest?" And they looked at him puzzled and said, "In the forest, as you would." And he said, "The things I teach are the equivalent of the leaves in my hand. There's a whole lot of other things that exist, but what I teach is just to help you progress on the path to enlightenment." Now, Buddha taught for about 40 years. Sometimes he was teaching to new people like us. Sometimes he was teaching to those who'd been with him for a long time. And so different teachings we might hear or read about, even if we don't understand them, it's okay. I read a book once, I actually bought it, thought it looked great, and started reading it. It was like double Dutch. It was someone's PhD, literally, but it was called Compassion in Tibetan Buddhism. A few years later, I just put it back on the shelf, my shelf, not in the shop. And a few years later, when I read it, I was like, this is great, this is fantastic, because I could understand it better. It was exactly the same book. It's just what I could understand. So, you know, gradually, we just have more understanding and we can appreciate the teachings. So, when the Buddha, the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, the being that we call Buddha, he was born 2,500 years ago. Sometimes the archaeologists and stuff say maybe more like 2,600 years ago. And so he was born to a royal family. His father was a great king, so he was Prince Siddhartha. And it was common for parents at that time to ask astrologers to come and give a reading for the child to predict the future of that child. So the astrologer who came said, well, this young prince will either be a great king like his father, or he'll be a great spiritual teacher. So at that time, spiritual practitioners and teachers, they lived in the forests, and the forests of India were littered with tigers and poisonous snakes, and the students and teachers didn't always have shelter or good food, all these different things. So his father didn't actually think that was what he wanted for his son, so he tried to keep him within the grounds of the palace, and there were children and others who came, and they had their own little community, if you like, within the palace walls. So over time, Buddha got older, and the different stages of his life are told through the 12 deeds, and we're going to go through those because they're a very classical thing. So, you know, many of us, we have these questions of, who am I? Why am I here? What does life mean? What does anyone's life mean? And we think of it in different ways and have different questions at different times in our life. Where did I come from? What happens when I die? And so what we think about those things may well change during our lifetime, but a lot of these things, there's not a black and white answer in the same way as there is to, you know, what time's the bus leaves for the city. These, you know, it's not quite like that. So this is why there are many different teachings about this. Different people, different spiritual traditions, they have different ideas about how these things work and the meaning of our life. So Buddha was born into this really wealthy family where he could easily attain the necessities for life. That, you know, they were not short of food or accommodation or all the sorts of things that we in Australia, very fortunately, can also access very easily. You know, if people are very poor in Australia, even the government will provide some assistance. There's non-government agencies, all sorts of people who can help. So in that sort of way, we have our life in that external way, our life's similar in a way, if you like, to as Buddha was growing up. But even though we have these external things, we sometimes still have a lot of suffering and unhappiness. And so in Buddhism, we try to look at what are the causes of those and avoid those. And on a physical level, that's quite easy. If we're hungry, we can go get something to eat. If we're tired, we can have a sleep. There's a lot of external things we can do to help satisfy whatever our physical discomforts might be. But when it comes to our internal suffering, our mental or emotional suffering, then it's not so easy. In Australia, where we actually have a land that, or a country with, there haven't been great wars, there's not been huge famine, and, you know, some of the things that other countries have, like almost in the background all the time, there's shooting and civil wars and external wars, all this sort of thing. You know, we have really quite, I suppose externally, quite a good life compared to some people living on this planet. But we also have a really high level of suicide. So this means that even though we have healthcare and education and food, it doesn't necessarily give us inner happiness, inner contentment. And so that's the sort of thing we're looking for in Buddhism, to develop our minds in a way that we have this inner contentment and peace. The Dalai Lama often talks about this inner being, that, you know, we need all these things like food and accommodation and there's nothing wrong with those. It's not to give up those, don't get me wrong. Giving up those won't give us inner happiness at all. Inner happiness is a different thing that we develop with our mind. So in the life story of the Buddha, it's told through these 12 deeds, and these reflect the main points of his life. And it's mostly a spiritual biography illustrating these aspects of Buddhism and describing how he moved through different stages of his life to this ultimate achievement of Buddhahood. The historical accuracy might be debatable according to some scholars, but an intellectual approach is not what we're talking about here. It's the teaching of the Dharma, the teaching the Buddha gave. That's what's of paramount importance. And these 12 deeds illustrate the choices that he made, I guess, in order to progress on that path. So Buddha and Dharma are both Sanskrit words. Buddha means enlightened one, and Dharma is literally translated as truth. But when Dharma's got a capital D, that means it's the Buddha Dharma, the Buddha teaching. So when we're thinking about these 12 deeds, we can consider how they might apply in our own lives. So the Buddha taught that we've had many past lives. Obviously, we didn't make the decisions the Buddha made, or we'd be enlightened. And if any of you are, we'll swap the whole technology around and you can teach, because I'm not. But we can think about, if we've had all these past lives, you know, then we've obviously done, from a Buddhist point of view, many virtuous things, or we would not have the good fortune to be able to live in a country like this, free of wars and famine, and with a good hospital system, a good education system, all these things. But having had that good fortune, then we need to use this life in a meaningful way. From the point of view of Buddhism, I don't know you, and I'm not making any sort of judgment about how you've lived your life, but from the point of view of Buddhism, each life we are trying to make our life meaningful. And so we've got this opportunity in this life. So Buddha said that it was only when he achieved full enlightenment he could look back across his past lives and see the benefits of virtuous actions that he had done in some life, and sometimes the results didn't turn up. You know, there might be some result in that life, but maybe it's in another 4 lives, 5 lives, who knows. And similarly with non-virtuous actions, motivated by anger or unkindness, whatever, there might be some results in that life, maybe later. So when I use the non-virtuous actions, that's any action that causes suffering to another being. It's also considered non-virtuous to harm ourselves, because we have an opportunity, and if we harm ourselves, then we're reducing that opportunity. We worked hard to get this opportunity, even if we don't remember it, and so we're then reducing, we're putting obstacles in our way to make the best use of that. Now, some people would say that, if we smoke or drink or drive too fast, all that sort of thing, we're putting our health at risk and things like that. But that's not what I'm talking about here. It's more the importance. The most harmful thing we can do is to abandon the development of our mind, abandon doing the things that are virtuous and helpful for others. This is where the sort of non-virtuous thing that we can do to ourselves. And so we can also use these 12 deeds to reflect on what changes we might want to make in this life or be able to make in this life, changing them to things that benefit it, not just in this life, but in all other lives as well. So if you look at the motivation, we had these 4 immeasurable thoughts. So we often do things to help our family or our friends. We do something to bring them some happiness. We make a meal for them, whatever it might be. And it's relatively easy. It doesn't take a whole lot of physical effort to think, wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone had nourishing food that they liked? And just having that thought, this is a virtuous thought. It isn't always that we can do anything about it, but we can have that thought, even if we just cook a meal for ourselves. In the dedication prayer that we read right at the end, it says, may the hungry find food, may the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. And, that's dedicating the effort that we've put into this class to achieving that goal. So let's look at these 12 deeds. So the first deed was descending from Tushita Pure Land. This is where the Buddha was prior to coming here. So at the time he entered the Pure Land, he was Bodhisattva Mahasattva, and so he was teaching in that Pure Land, And often these are written in quite poetic ways. So it said that he gave his last teaching and then placed his crown on the head of Maitreya, who's the next Buddha coming. And so he's teaching now in Tushita. And so then he came down to this earth, which is Jamdvipa in Sanskrit. It's what it's called. And so it said that he came down in the form of an elephant with a white elephant with 6 tusks. So this is a fantastical animal. So it means this was a fantastic event that happened. It doesn't mean, you know, if we run around and find an elephant, a white elephant with 6 tusks, that's the next Buddha. That isn't what it means. So then Buddha, because we've had many bodies and had many rebirths in many different realms, different planets, different galaxies, what comes from one life to the next is the continuum of our mind. Our mind goes from one life to the next. So things we develop in our mind, they can, as long as we don't do something the opposite, then we can take those positive things into our future lives, wherever they might be. So the second deed was the entry into his mother's womb. So while she was asleep, this elephant entered the right side of her, maybe. Anyway, entered the womb. So the important thing here is that what we can think about is where would we be reborn next? Most of us don't know that. And the characteristics we might take into our next life. So when the Buddha entered the womb, it was on the full moon, the 15th day of the Vesak, the 4th month of the lunar calendar, which is when they talk about these different dates. There was a lunar calendar now, and the Buddhist Tibetan dates still followed a lunar calendar, and there were a number of these 12 deeds that happened specifically on this date. So then the next of the 12 deeds, and the thing about this is considered his birth. When we talk about the 15th day of this 4th month of the lunar calendar, Vesak or Sakadawa in Tibetan. So it's said to be commemorates the birth, enlightenment and parinirvana, these 3 major deeds of the Buddha. And in Buddhist teachings, conception is what's considered birth. There's not 2 separate words for that. And conception is when we're born, and the next moment is when we start aging, which is a bit tricky. We're not even born, but in reality we know that we're 9 months past conception, give or take, when we actually physically leave the mother's womb. But so when it talks about the birth, it's because there's not a separate word. That is the time they're talking about in the Buddhist teaching. So the next deed, the 3rd deed, was the birth in Lumbini. So this is a place that's now in Nepal, but it was India. They were part of the same country at this time. So the Buddha is said to have emerged from her right side, same as he went in, and he took 7 steps in the different directions. He was born with the characteristics or the similarity to like about a 2-year-old child, and so he could walk. He took 7 steps in each direction and said, "Thus have I come for the well-being of the world." So this means that as a young person, he had, you know, an idea of coming to benefit others. And so from this we can think about when did we start having ideas about what we wanted to achieve in this lifetime? And what is it? What have we done with it so far? Have we achieved those goals? I mean, we have goals quite early on, don't we? We want to be a nurse or a pilot and that changes every other week. For some kids have a wonderful imagination that they can do everything. But over time, we come to determine whatever career it is we're going to have, and we work towards achieving that. So we don't always achieve exactly what we might set out to do, or we might be delayed in achieving that. But what we can do now is think about, well, what is it I want to achieve in the rest of this lifetime? What is it I want to achieve? And we have wildly different things. I know an elderly lady who I haven't seen for a while because she's in a nursing home and I can't visit her. She always wanted to be a mother and look after children. She was an only child, and she finished up having 5 children of her own, and she raised 2 children from her second husband. So this was her goal, and she really is happy that she was able to raise all those children. And I think that would have been a really busy life. 90 years ago, there was, whenever she started having children, there weren't many labour-saving devices, but she really rejoices that she had that in her life. So, we have different goals in life, and, when we're in our 90s, if we should live that long, are we going to be able to look back and think, yeah, I did those things I wanted to do. I worked to achieve those things, and I was able to actually achieve them. So this is, a reflection we can do once in a while at whatever age we might be. So the 4th deed of the Buddha, it says, became skilled in the arts and playing sports and things like this. So he studied. He was skilled in able to do different things. He had a strong body, a strong mind. So we can think, what did we do with that youthful energy we had in this life? I wasted a lot of mine. We tend to do, really quite wild things when we're young sometimes. But if we've managed to survive, if we haven't driven ourselves off the edge of a cliff or something else, which was not beyond the possibilities when I was young, then we can think about, we had all that energy, possibly less now, but we do have some energy now, and what are we going to do with that? What is it we're going to use our energy for now? And what do we develop for this life and for our future lives? And, a certain amount of our energy, of course, goes to helping others and things like that. And, how do we allocate that? So the 5th deed always sounds a little bit weird. Taking charge of the kingdom and keeping a harem. Now, it was possibly the habit for kings at that time to have quite a few people around him. Whether it was specifically a harem or not there were less words. There's less words in Sanskrit, less words in Tibetan than there are in English. But anyway, at the age of 29, the prince married a princess called Yasodhara, and they had a happy life together. And, we can reflect on our relationships. How, are they satisfying relationships? At work, at home, with our children, our parents, this sort of thing. Our lives are imperfect. This is samsara. So, what are the things that we might be able to do? Are there things we want to do? Are there things we shouldn't postpone? In our relationships, it's, sometimes if someone suddenly separated from us, and this has happened a bit recently with the COVID-19 and the infection and things like that, people are separated because someone's infected. They become sicker and sicker and die, and people have no opportunity to tell them how much they love them and that sort of thing, or very limited opportunities. And, you know, the jobs we have, sometimes we have jobs because they pay the rent, and that's okay. That's okay. But, you know, there are sometimes other things we'd like to do that we find more satisfying. So, you know, whether that's a voluntary job or we take up crochet or whatever it might be, we need to bring some satisfaction into our life, whether it's in a paid way or an unpaid enjoyment that we have. Because this balance in our life allows for us time to reflect and think about things, think about our life, what's important for us. The sixth deed is called going to the four gates of the city and becoming discouraged with cyclic existence and leaving the householder's life. So during a drive outside the palace, one day Prince Siddhartha saw an old man. Well, sometimes it says an old person, I'm not sure. A sick man, the body of a dead man. And because he'd lived in the palace in a fairly protected environment, sometimes it said these were on different occasions, but that's not the point. He also saw a monk, a renunciate. So seeing these four people, particularly the first three, he asked his driver or attendant, what's wrong with this person who's, you know, all hunched over and crippled, this old man, this sick person lying there on the bed, whatever it might be. And does this happen to many people? Are there many of these people? You know, he hadn't thought about any of this because he'd been protected from these things. And so when the driver said, yeah, this happens to us all, because the driver was an ordinary human being who lived with people who, you know, got sick and died. So this, coming to this awareness, this is what sparked his idea of wanting to relieve the suffering that he saw all people. He came to see that this was true, that, you know, his parents were getting older and he had this young son who was changing and growing up and that sort of thing. And so he came to see that this wonderful life he'd had, this would come to an end and there would be suffering in these things that happen. So pretty much against the will of his father, he kind of had to sneak out. He left the kingdom and went into the forest and found teachers and got instructions. So one of the first things he did when he left the palace was to cut off his hair. So, because royal people had this long hair, so he cut that off. And so, you know, ordained people now, we all have this hairdo, very low maintenance. But it's remembering that he cut off his royal wonderful hair. And so this is letting go of things that are not so important. I'm not suggesting any of you take up this hairdo. Don't get me wrong. So someone said recently to me, you know, Buddha, he just up and left his wife and child. Well, actually, Buddha's wife died 7 days after. Buddha's mother died 7 days after, and, you know, so he didn't actually leave all his family. His mother had left him through death when he was young, and his wife and child were going to be well cared for. It's not that he abandoned them into poverty or anything like that. But what he was wanting to find was the answer to how to prevent their future suffering of facing old age, sickness and death. Relentlessly again and again and again, he was looking for the answer to that. What would be the way to prevent this for all of us, including his wife and child? Excuse me. So many of us have had some experience with, you know, parents dying, friends dying, people becoming sick, us becoming sick, all these different things. And, you know, we can think about how difficult that is, how very difficult that is, and how it's probably going to be very difficult for us when it comes to the end of our life. So often we try to avoid thinking about those things. Some people, we seem to have this superstition in us that if we think about it or talk about it, then maybe it'll bring it closer or something. But, you know, somewhere along the way we need to accept that we've lost all that energy and health, and that we had the vigour that we had as a young person. And, you know, how easily will we accept assistance from others when we need help and things like that. And, you know, consider what is it we want to do with the rest of this life. What are the things that we would hope to achieve before we met that state? In the teachings of Buddha on this subject, it's like death is certain, the time of death is uncertain, and what helps us at the time of death is the Dharma, our spiritual understanding of that process. That's what can help us at that time. So this is why Buddha left the royal palace and went off into the forest to live with all those snakes and things that were in the forest at the time. So the seventh deed is practicing austerities for 6 years. So the Buddha studied with the teachers and they were quite happy with his progress and were happy for him to stay, but he went off and did this retreat for 6 years with 5 other students, I guess they were at the time, and they were trying to realise as much as they could about developing calm, peaceful state of mind through meditation. And it was quite austere that these, you know, they didn't have a lot of food or shelter or anything like that. And so what Buddha came to see after 6 years was that having all the wealth he had as a child, that he could have still been living in this luxurious situation, or this, on the other hand, these ascetic practices that were very, sometimes only, you know, a berry or two for the day's food and this sort of thing. Seeing that neither of these extremes actually helped him achieve what he wanted to achieve. They didn't bring the answers to how to avoid this continual rebirth, continual suffering rebirth. And so for us, you know, we can look at our lives and see, you know, have we got extremes of behaviour that aren't really benefiting us, aren't really helping us achieve what we want, and what can we do to let go of those? So, you know, smoking's the perfect thing, isn't it? Many smokers don't want to smoke. They so much want to give up smoking. They know it's harming them, but it's such an addictive thing. It's really difficult for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, it's a really difficult thing. So that's in the physical way, but of course in Buddhism what we're looking about, what are the things we hold on to in our mind that are obstacles for us, and what can we do to reduce them? So then the Buddha left the retreat and the other 5 people thought he'd given up his spiritual practice. So he went to Bodh Gaya, which is in the middle of India. You can go there. There's a big Mahabodhi stupa there. And he sat under a tree, a Bodhi tree. So this Bodhi is a word for enlightenment, and so it got named after he'd sat there and become enlightened, of course. And he had a pile of grass to sit on, and he vowed that he wouldn't arise, that he would just sit there until he attained that knowledge, that enlightened wisdom that he was seeking. And so there are many stories about this this tree, that it's the original tree died, even though people tried to preserve it, but they got a seed from a tree in Sri Lanka where they knew that the seed for that tree had come. So this is the grandchild of the original tree, if you like, and it's very carefully, that whole area, it's a UNESCO site, so it's very carefully preserved and beautiful. Though at one time it fell into a lot of, it was discarded as a site, and it was actually an Englishman who was searching and looking, and an archaeologist kind of guy, I guess, who found it. But it's now very easy to visit, and there are people circumambulating there all day and things like that.
A question from Jan. If the Buddha had never experienced enlightenment before, how was he aware of it when he became enlightened?
Aware that he was enlightened?
Yeah.
So this was an intuitive thing. One of the things we develop on the way to enlightenment, there are many different internal things that we develop, including a level of clairvoyance and extrasensory hearing and things like this. And what he came to see, what he achieved, was that he could look back on his lives and see these different things, and that he could. So the enlightened state is ultimate wisdom, ultimate compassion, and ultimate capacity to help others. That's a very short version of if it was just those words, that'd be easy. But so the ultimate wisdom is this wisdom that perceptually realises emptiness, which is a very difficult thing to get your head around, and we won't be covering very much of that. But it's having achieved that, you see how things exist and how they don't exist, and so you have this. That gives you the capacity then to recognise what would be beneficial for others and things like that. So Buddha said that in time we will all achieve this. So we'll know it because he'd been studying for 6 years with the Hindu teachers, because it was a Hindu country where he was born. So he had something, he had a good spiritual understanding anyway, but he could see there was this question that wasn't being answered for him about how to avoid this continual round of what's called uncontrolled rebirth, taking rebirth we don't know where. And so he could see then what it was that the future held for him and for others, and so was able to help them. So does that answer your question?
We'll wait and see. So I suppose, Venerable, this is just what I'm thinking, that if someone says, trust me, I'm enlightened.
Well, generally people who are enlightened wouldn't say that. Because then people treat you weird and different.
And they certainly wouldn't ask you for money. Trust me, I'm enlightened, give me your money.
No, they definitely wouldn't be asking you for money, because that's not where their focus is. But many of the great teachers who we might consider to be enlightened, or bodhisattvas, teachers like His Holiness, these Lama Zopa, these different teachers, they would never say that, because we're human beings who would then treat them either by staying away because we feel so ashamed of all the things that we might think or do that they know about now, because they're enlightened, they can look at us and see in our mind because they have this clairvoyance, or we'd become like, I don't know, rock star groupies or something, neither of which is going to help that person do the work that they've come to this earth to do.
So Jan's also wondering about the nature of enlightenment. Like, do you stop thinking like the rest of us are thinking all the time? We have our attachment and our imperfections. Like, does that stop?
No, the thinking doesn't stop. The thinking stopping is more like nirvana, which is a stage. Some people progress to nirvana, which is no suffering, and it's called a state of peace. But enlightenment includes, as well as we all need to achieve what people achieve to go to, if that's their goal, and they go there. But that's all the wisdom teachings. But because for enlightenment, there's also the teachings on compassion, the methods of doing things that benefit others. And so it doesn't take effort to the sort of effort that it takes for us. What is it I can do? How's the best way to do it? All that sort of thing, because Buddhas have the wisdom that they can see what is the long-term benefit. They can see that there's possibly the person will feel better if they get more chocolate. But and we can see this in the long term, just endless chocolate just makes us sick. But in a similar way, they can see what's the long-term benefit for the person. Does that answer the question? So there's not a lot of effort in the thinking. There's an intuitive knowing, but then there's also the capacity then to as much as possible, provide the conditions or the circumstances to help that person. Because whether we choose, it's a bit like the cigarette smokers, no matter what we know in our head, no matter what we feel about how much we wish we didn't do it, how, being able to stop is a whole other level, isn't it? The capacity to stop is and as I'm not picking on smokers, this is over many, many things.
Yeah, that's good.
So, from this, can we make a determined effort to practice virtue as much as possible to benefit those around us when we can? So number 9 of these 12 deeds, overcoming the host of demons. So when the Buddha sat, so Mara is the word that's used for an external being that sends obstacles to us. So Mara sent these different kinds of wrathful beings and sensual beings to try and distract the Buddha from what he was trying to achieve, this single-pointed concentration. And so these can be seen as external things, and when they're representing our internal states of mind, our inner disturbances and emotions of anger and craving and clinging, this sort of thing. So, but the Buddha refused to be distracted. And so he sat there and he actually touched, and you should be able to see on the Buddha behind me, his right hand is touching it's described as the moon cushion here, but touched the earth in front of him. And he called on the earth goddess as his witness. And she said, "O greatest of beings, you'll achieve the highest accomplishment." Whereupon Mara and his hosts and his demons all fled, or Buddha overcame these internal obstacles. So for us, we need to remember that the practice of Dharma is to overcome these afflictive states of mind that are obstacles for us in our progress. And the antidotes to those is developing their opposite. In Buddhism, it isn't that we try to physically remove these things, they're part of our mind. And so we try to develop the opposite in our mind. And we can often identify either we're often impatient, or in certain circumstances we're impatient, whatever it might be. And then we can actively put our effort into developing patience in that circumstance. What's the point of being impatient? It leads us to become agitated and aggravated, and that can stay with us all day, even if the aggravation was a peak hour traffic going to work. We can still be cranky about it that night if we put it, if we're not careful. So, we need to work with our mind to see, is this a beneficial thing? What else could I do that might be of benefit? This sort of thing. And, these different things appear in our mind. There are things that we like and things we don't. And we still grasp after the ones that we like and we try to push away the ones we don't. But, you know, different things will come. They're all impermanent, so we just have to accept that. So on the 10th day, the 10th deed, Buddha became fully enlightened on this special day, the 15th day of the 4th month. So he was sitting there in solitude, and it said that during the second watch of the night, don't ask me the exact times, he saw all his countless past lives and the passing of these endless forms of life that we have, constantly going round and round with rebirth, sickness, old age, death. And then during the third watch, he attained full enlightenment. And so it said that all those who'd previously achieved Buddhahood paid homage to him. And so this is why this, you know, in this second and third watch of the night, when these really precious things happen, this is why often when people go and retreat, their first session they try to be doing during this time when the Buddha had this awareness and became enlightened. So they're doing virtuous dharmic act. If you're going to go into retreat, you know, doing things at the optimum times of the day or the month or something can just help or remind us, but also bring benefit. So, you know, for ourselves, how often do we remember that, you know, compassion and patience, these are the things that actually bring us happiness, and we can increase them. These are not things that we can have too much of. Being patient doesn't mean you let people walk over you. It's just when they walk over you, you don't, you know, you might remove yourself or whatever, but you don't decide, well, I now need to walk over you. So Buddha then became the Buddha we know now, Shakyamuni Buddha. So Shakya, this is his family name. He was born into it's often called the Shakya clan, but that's just because this, you know, wording. That was his family name. Muni means able one or sage. And so Buddha, this is enlightened or awakened one. So then in the 11th deed, which is called turning the wheel of Dharma, and again, he actually did this on the 4th day of the 6th month, which is a couple of months after, you know, Sakadawa, a couple of months, 6 weeks, something like that. But anyway, yet to come in this year. So for 7 weeks, the Buddha just sat in silent contemplation under the tree. Being enlightened, he didn't need to worry about food, drink, or any of these sorts of things. And he thought, this is wonderful, but it's too hard to teach. I can't explain this to others. It's just too difficult, whatever. But 2 of the Brahmin gods asked, Brahma and Indra, Hindu gods, asked him to please teach. Having achieved this, please for the benefit of all beings. So he went to Varanasi, and there he turned the first wheel of Dharma. So this is often demonstrated by a particular thing that's often on the front of various temples, a couple of deer, because where he went to do this was in Deer Park, and he knew that the 5 disciples that he'd been studying with in the retreat, that they would be at that place at that time. And so the first teaching he gave was to those disciples, those people he'd been in retreat with. And there's a little verse that I guess encapsulates all the Buddha's teachings that he gave in those at that time. Avoid all the non-virtues, only do virtuous actions, subdue your mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. And then the 12th deed, this was passing from sorrow at Kushingara. So he went, in his 80s, he went to this place and told his attendant, his disciple, that this was the end of his days. And so then he passed into parinirvana, which is where he still teaches. It's not him going to peace and ignoring the rest of the suffering world. He still brings benefit to all of us. So we can think about how we're preparing for our own deaths.